I tell my students, always at the beginning of the semester when we talk about the bureaucracy, I said, don't fall asleep. There's some exciting policy decisions that are happening in the bureaucracy every day, every minute of the workday. And I think I was drawn to the bureaucracy, and particularly policymaking in the bureaucracy, because I looked around and saw hundreds of scholars that study congressional policymaking and some of the nuances of congressional policymaking, and almost no one that studies bureaucratic policymaking. Yet it's readily acknowledged that it's an important venue for politics. So why is that? And what do we know about it? And I think the answers were so few and far between that I was naturally drawn to it. Rulemaking at the federal level in the US can be explained pretty simply. So think of Congress passing a piece of legislation, sending it on to the president for his or her signature or veto. So say the president signs it. Well, what happens next? The president typically will send that piece of legislation on to the appropriate substantive administrative agency to implement. In the words of the Supreme Court, to quote, fill up the details of incomplete and sometimes vague congressionally passed legislation. So example, a piece of highway legislation is passed in Congress, goes to the Department of Transportation to fill in those details. So Congress in the 1940s prescribed the process by which all agencies, not just the Department of Transportation, will write those rules. And the process is pretty simple. First, the agency officials gather the text of what they call a proposed rule. Think of it like a draft paper, if you will. That draft has to be publicized, so all of us, in theory, should know about the text of that draft rule. The agency officials have to have a certain amount of time where anybody that's interested in the draft rule can write a comment, a public letter that says how they should change the draft rule. After the agency officials receive all those public comments, they issue what's called a final rule. And the important thing about the final rule is sort of twofold. One, it's legally binding. It's legally binding just like legislation. And two, while agency officials have to take in those public comments, they don't have to change the draft rule based on the public comments. They just have to take in and consider them. Yet these notice and comment procedures in rulemaking that are codified within rulemaking are supposed to increase both public participation in rulemaking and also important transparency in rulemaking. That's two of the main reasons why Congress passed these reforms in the 1940s. It's unclear how well it's done so, but think of it this way. Compare the process that I just described on rulemaking, this logical process in which public participation has to be taken, to congressional policymaking, where members of Congress don't have to systematically take in the views of the public before they vote. I mean, in that sense, this is a tremendous democratized mechanism for making public policy choices. This recent paper on rulemaking was trying to focus on who participates in rulemaking and how influential are they. So myself and a co-author undertook a big data collection project where we sampled a number of rules across federal government agencies, collected those rules, so both that draft rule and the final rule, so the texts of those, as well as all the public comments that came into those rules during the public commenting process. And first measured who's participating and tried to categorize those participants, as well as measuring what did they want and how successful were they in moving the policy content between the draft rule and the final rule. So in this study, in the Bias Toward Business study, we collected a large number of federal government regulations. So over 30 federal government regulations across 4 different agencies in the federal context, covering both transportation agencies as well as agencies within the Department of Labor, including OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is a very controversial agency. So we collected a sample of rules, collected the text of both the draft rule and the final rule, and then collected all the public comments to those rules. So it's around 1,700 public comments. And those public comments, they can be half a page long or they can be 20 pages long. We read, myself and several graduate student coders read all of these public comments and categorized them in several different ways. For instance, we read the public comments and analyzed, what are the main issues that are being brought up across this set of public comments to this rule? And we listed them. What are the 5 main issues? We identified them. And then we looked at the final rule and said, is there any change that's taking place between the draft rule and the final rule on these top commenter issues? And when you can identify that the commenters are all bringing up the same issue, and there's actually a change that's been made in the final rule on this issue, you have then verified that this public commenting process is valid. It is actually being used in the way that we want it to be used. It's being used to inform our regulatory policymaking decisions. Part of what we were looking for is just who these commenters are. So what kind of affiliation do they put on the letterhead when they're writing in? Are they the president of IBM, a major corporation, or are they the president of a local Teamster union in Missouri? We want to know who they are, where they're coming from, so not just their organization, but also from distributed across the country, where are they coming from? And one of the interesting things we found in this study is we had hypothesized that a lot of these commenters would be coming from the DC area. Right? These are federal regulations, sort of inside baseball, if you will. But while there were a fair number of DC commenters in our study, there were also a fair number of commenters across the nation, commenters from Iowa and California, commenters from Utah and Nebraska. We had a number of expectations for what we might find. Our first expectation was that we expected businesses and business interests to be the most active participants in this rulemaking process. And there's a number of reasons to expect that. One is that while this is a very, in theory, transparent, democratizing institution, this notice and comment process, it can be very hidden and under the radar screen of the vast majority of citizens. And so you'd expect the people that are most affected by these rules and regulations to be the folks that participate. We also had the expectation that while business groups might be the highest participants in the process, we weren't necessarily sure that they would be the most influential. We thought that potentially, going into the project, we felt that public interest groups, while there may be fewer of them, might have stronger voices, and their voices might be magnified during the notice and comment process. There's certainly a bias toward business in participation in rulemaking, and we found that in our study, and several other scholars have found that as well. What really sets our study apart is the focus on influence as well during the notice and comment process. And we found that business participants and business commenters are the most influential participants during the notice and comment process. And I think that was a surprise. Another surprising part of our work, though, and it's not highlighted as much in our article, but I'm very interested in it, is that governments and sub-governments, so state governments, local governments, were also major commenters during the process, and they had very influential voices. And so it sort of calls into question this notion of federalism within the United States context as well. So how do state and local officials influence federal decision making? I think that's something we'll explore in future work. Well, one of the big questions that we always think about in political science is who participates and how influential are they? And I think one of the questions that is answered in our work is, and at least in the rulemaking context, the folks that you would most think would participate, the regulated entities, the businesses that are affected by rules and regulations, are the greatest participants. They're the participants consistently on rules. And they're the participants on not just rules that gain a lot of high salience and high public attention, but also the rules, sort of the everyday business of regulatory policymaking, the bureaucracy, the rules that get very few public comments. And so I think that that actually makes a lot of sense. We, I think as a society, want people that are affected by rules and our policies to be stakeholders in the policy decision-making process. What I think is missing in sort of the small d democracy question here is, where is the other side? Where is the public interest groups? Where are the average citizens? They obviously have important views to be held, to come forth to, and they don't as well during the rulemaking process. if financial regulation passes in the Congress and it's sent to the appropriate substantive agency to implement and rules are written, we're going to expect to see that the big banks are going to be major players in the regulatory process. You know, what's different, though, about financial regulation is it's got a lot of media attention, and not all rules do. And so I think we'll also see major citizen groups be active in that process as well. And I think that's important for our democracy. When we see some of that tension, some of that conflict between groups, we give our agency policymakers more information to make their final decisions. And that's the kind of context that we want them to be making regulatory policymaking decisions. Well, I think citizen groups could have influence over regulations, and I think being in the game is an important part of the rulemaking process because, you know, part of the responsiveness that takes place, that agency officials, when they look at the public comments that come in, they're continually being overseen by our judiciary. So the courts play a very important role in rulemaking. It's probably not so clear when you just think about this linear rulemaking process, but the courts are continually overseeing this process. And the courts are asking themselves, when rules are appealed to the courts, were the public comments considered? Were the arguments that were made within the public comments addressed in the final rule by agency officials? So if public interest groups were active, or more active, they are active at some level, but more active during the rulemaking process, they, in theory, should have a greater voice in the rulemaking process. I think I'll add one caveat, though, and that's that it can be quite expensive to participate in the rulemaking process. And one of the reasons why it's expensive is that agency officials are very much looking for information, technical studies, data that helps them make decisions about public policy choices. Oftentimes, agency officials are experts. They're very drawn to tactical information. Traditionally, businesses, corporations, trade associations have put more money into generating that type of information. And because of that, one could hypothesize that they have a great deal more influence on rulemaking in the aggregate. Well, there's a number of ways that the government could encourage citizen participation during the notice and comment process. And I think one of the steps toward doing so has been the promulgation of these rules on the web. So the Bush administration, continuing with the Obama administration, has vowed to put all regulations, proposed regulations, on the web for public viewing, provided an easy way on the website reg.gov to provide public comments to rules, as well as providing those final texts of rules on websites. And I think that's one important step toward getting the information out to concerned citizens and the public. So we've talked today a lot about notice and comment rulemaking, this really interesting democratizing institution. But it leads us to this really important question. So where does this proposed rule come from? Where does this draft rule, which is often hundreds of pages, can be hundreds of pages long, filled with technical detail, where does this proposed rule come from? There's a whole process, a political process before the draft rule that I call the pre-proposal stage of rulemaking. So this is between Congress saying you have to write a rule and the agency writing the draft rule. And it turns out there's lots of politics going on at that stage as well. So bear with me here. So in the notice and comment process, there's court-prohibited ex parte communications. And essentially that means that people that aren't participating by submitting regular comments can't just call up a regulator and let them know their opinion. They have to actually have their opinion docketed, put in the public file so it's transparent. So before the rule is promulgated, there's no such prohibition. And that encourages, and in fact it's well documented by case study research, agency officials contacting oftentimes regulated entities to find out what kind of information should go into this proposed rule. So I have just finished a new study that looks at this early participation process, looks again at the text of that draft rule, and then does a large interview, systematic interview of people that might be participants in this process, and finds out, sure enough, there's lots of active, engaged, regulated entities that are speaking, having telephone conversations, as well as face-to-face conversations and email with regulators before the promulgation of this draft rule. And it turns out to be a very important political venue for influence in the policymaking process. Well, I first became interested in being a professor in political science when I was working on Capitol Hill. So after I was an undergraduate, I felt like, as an undergraduate, sometimes the concepts didn't come alive in a way that I wanted them to. And when I went to Capitol Hill, I saw policy being made, and I saw Congress in action, and I started asking a whole bunch of questions. Like, how does this really happen? Who works with who? Who works with whom? And why do they do so? And that's why I went to graduate school in political science. I considered going to law school very seriously, come from a family of lawyers, and think that that's important and valuable work. But I felt myself continually drawn back to some of the systematic processes that might be underlying politics, and that's why I chose political science. I think political scientists are oftentimes tackling what you and I would think of as important problems. One of the questions before our Congress, for instance, is how to best continually reform the U.S. bureaucracy to make it more and more efficient. Well, those are important questions. We want bureaucratic policymaking, we want the outputs that bureaucracy places on its citizens to be efficient, effective, have equality in those benefits. But if we don't know who's participating in the bureaucratic policy-making process, or if we don't know who bureaucrats are being responsive to, how can one really ask Congress to actually reform the process? I mean, political scientists at some level, folks that study bureaucratic politics like myself, I feel are providing some of the raw inputs to decision makers like Congress to make sure they make valid, important decisions on things like reforming the bureaucracy.